Jesus, we love you, we worship and adore you. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name. Jesus. Glorify thy name. We will glorify thy name in all the earth.
Hi, I'm John Miller, and I want to invite you to Extreme Home Makeovers for Families. God can make our homes absolutely fantastic. Let's begin with the program now. Welcome to Extreme Home Makeovers, as we look at the subject of stabilizing the unstable family. Some families are more stable than others, because some people are more stable than others. Some of us come out of stable backgrounds. We came from where mom and dad loved each other all their lives, and they stayed married all their lives, and they brought us up and they taught us those values, and we just kind of learned them. It just kind of soaked through our skin. We didn't really have a lot of choice about it. It's just what we saw, and we tend to repeat that when that's the case. But that's not always the case in our world nowadays. In fact, we're told now the majority of folks come from a less stable circumstance than that. That in many cases, the children have gone through the trauma of divorce in their parents' lives. Sometimes when they're very young, sometimes when they're old. And interestingly enough, we found that whichever the case may be, whether young or old, the damage is significant and it's lifelong. It doesn't ever really go away. In fact, some young people choose not to marry so they won't have to divorce. They sort of think the two may be connected in some way. There are other things too that can make marriages unstable. In fact, there is stress in our world today that probably our moms and dads didn't have to face in the degree that we have to face it. There's a lady named Carla Karkoff who came up with a list of stressors that she sees in family life. And I thought I'd share some of those and let you just think about them and think about how they fit in your world. Number one stressor, according to her, was economics. And you know the prices do keep going up, don't they? And the expectations of what we think we need in order to be comfortable just keeps getting greater and greater. And so the pressure on the pocketbook gets more and more and more. And some of us have gone into borrowing to try to keep up with the neighbors or keep up with what we think we need until we end up with all kinds of stress and pressure. And she says that finances and budgeting is one of the big problems in making a stable home life a reality for us. But right next to that, she lists problems with the kids. And you know, they've done studies about this, and they find that the most things that we fuss and fight about is how we're going to spend the money or how we already spent the money, and now we're trying to figure out what we're going to do about it, and then how are we going to bring up the children. Again, we talked earlier about our background. I just see that coming in so many of these circumstances. If you came up in a pretty strongly disciplined family, then you just naturally think that's the way your children need to be raised. For example, if the opposite is the case, though, you may have a very different opinion about that. How are we going to discipline the children? How are we going to deal with their problems? I know when I started out, I kind of thought that, we would raise the ideal family. My wife and I had both criticized our parents and their generation, and we thought we had it figured out right. And we weren't going to make any mistakes, and we were going to rear the perfect children. And lo and behold, everything went fine until we had one. I'd gone to school and I'd heard the teacher tell us, you boys go out there and you tell those people how to raise those kids, because one of these days you'll have some and then you'll be as humble as the rest of us. And I found out he was right. I started out, I had a sermon, 10 commandments for rearing children. And then we had ours, and wouldn't you know it, she took after my wife's side of the family. And it was just more difficult as we went along, it seemed like, So my sermon title changed. Instead of 10 commandments, it became 10 suggestions for rearing children. And now we've got kids, we've gone through the teen years, we've gotten into the 20s, we've even got one of them into the 30s. And in fact, we have children ranging over a 20-year span. Almost all the problems and stress and troubles that we can talk about, we've experienced personally in our lives. So our kids are 38 to 18. It sounds like a really bad Little League ball game, doesn't it? And that's just kind of where, where we come from with this. We can sense the stress. We understand it. And so we all deal with this. And we know that she's right. That is a major problem. A third major problem that she sees is insufficient couple time. And boy, it is the truth, isn't it? Most of us feel like we really are getting cheated in the amount of time we have with our spouse. It first happens maybe when the little children come along. First year or two of dating, if you're lucky, will be a lot like maybe the first year or so of marriage, except you start finding adjustments. You start discovering things about your spouse you hadn't expected. They'd put the best foot forward, and now you're meeting the other foot, and it's not quite the same situation. And then the kids come along, and all of a sudden they're time magnets. Have you noticed this about the kids? I mean, and they want your attention, and they want it all the time. They don't want it a little of the time. They want it all the time. And where's there going to be time now for you? And then there's work, and then there's hobbies, and even church activities take up time. Where are you going to have some time? And it can build into frustration, and the first thing you know, it's making the marriage less stable than it really ought to be. Fourthly, she says there is a lack of shared responsibility. Have you sat down and have you talked things through? Have you thought about the problems and the circumstances where you're living? And have you talked about what could we do to make the burden easier for each other? How can we share the burden better? How can we make a difference with one another? Well, she says that is a major stressor in our families. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this seminar as we go along. And then she says communicating with the children. Do you remember when they talked about a generation gap? Now it just seems there's gaps everywhere, doesn't it? It seems like it kind of proliferated. It kind of just grew and grew and grew and grew. How do we talk to the kids? Do they even talk our language? Do we talk their language? How can we get on a wavelength with the children? That's something that worries lots and lots of folks. But then they say that beyond that, there is the insufficient time for me. If I don't nurture myself, if I don't take care of myself, I don't have very much to share with anybody else. When will there be time for me? On top of that, she adds the guilt for not accomplishing more. We thought it would be better. Have you been there? Have you lived that way? Yeah. We didn't think it would be like this. We didn't know so much trouble could come to our family. Have you ever said something like that? I remember sitting in a young couples class, just kind of on the back row, not really doing anything that day, but just being there, and I heard this couple in front of me say, I just don't know what we're going to do with our son. And their son was that long. And already they didn't know what to do with it. Wait till that son grows up a little bit more. There's going to be bigger problems, and you're going to feel like, I didn't do enough, I haven't loved him enough, I haven't been close enough, I haven't been thoughtful enough, and so I get mad at me. And that tends to instabilize the situation. Then there is the spousal relationship. There's all that communication and friendship that's supposed to be building in the relationship. When will it build? When will we find time for it? That friendship, even the sexual relationship that's to exist in that marriage, how are we going to supply that? How are we going to meet that need? And then there's the overscheduling. Does the calendar just rule your life? Boy, it's easy to do that. Before we know it, we just don't have any time left for us. We're going mornings, we're going nights. As the kids grow up, all of a sudden they need a taxi service. Who's going to do that? Oftentimes it falls to mom when she can't get to it. It's dad. Sometimes grandma and grandpa get in on it. Time for one another. And on top of that, I'd want to mention that many times we're separated from the extended families. I was blessed in that I got to grow up pretty much in the old rural kind of tradition, where Grandma and Grandpa's farm joined our farm. And my uncle and aunt's farm joined that farm. And the other grandparents weren't very far away. And I know as a child growing up, whenever I got crossways with my father or my mother, Grandma and Grandpa, uncles and aunts were there and they helped. They helped mom and dad. They helped with the children. Many of us today are so far removed from grandma and grandpa that other than seeing them on a few holidays, we just don't really have them to help us out. And so somehow we're uprooted. Somehow we're shortchanged. We don't quite have what we need. What can we do about situations like the ones we've been mentioning in the last few minutes? Well, I'd like to ask you to turn with me in Scripture. I'd like to look at a passage with you, and then I would like to share with you how we can build some strength in our home. The passage I want to go to is 1 Peter chapter 3, if you have your Bible. 1 Peter chapter 3. Let's look for a way to stabilize our homes. The passage begins this way. Verse 1, 1 Peter 3. Wives, likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, as if that even if some that do not obey the word, without a word they may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. He begins by saying there's something that wives can do. They can accept God's way of dealing with life, and that is in the marriage, understand that they can be subject to their husband. Now I notice that is her choice. That's not his choice, that's her choice. When I drive down the road and I see a police car, I decide to be subject to that police car. I decide I'm going to pay attention to what he says. If he wants me to pull over, I'll pull over. Not because I think he's superior to me, but in the way things are ordered, he is in charge on the highway. And I'm going to listen to him. I'm going to do what he says. I may have more education than he does. I may have more money than he does. But those things don't matter. We're not saying in any way that the wife is inferior. She is equal, and we're going to notice that in a few verses later. But God said, this is the way I want it to operate. Wives, this is a choice, he says, that you can make. And then he goes on and talks about your spiritual relationship with the Lord and your husband's relationship with the Lord. He says your conduct can make a difference. And then he goes to talking about a beautiful thing. Do not let it be the adornment of merely outward arranging of hair and wearing of gold and putting on a fine apparel, but rather let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and a quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. Oh, I love that phrase. Isn't that beautiful? A gentle and a quiet spirit. How can I have that kind of spirit? Well, the only way that Peter says you can have it is to do like the great women of old had done. He particularly names one of them. Her name was Sarah. And he says of these ladies that they put their trust in God. They depended on Him, not on themselves. And they were not afraid, and they lived their life in faith. I'm going to say to husbands and wives, how do we bring stability to our home and to our marriage? It's going to be when we decide to live our lives in faith to God. We're accepting His way just because He said it to us. Just because we know He loves us. And just because we know we can depend on Him. Ladies, there's a wonderful quality that is described about this woman, Sarah, as you look down in those verses that follow. It says in verse 6, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. You remember the passage where he is referred to by Sarah, his wife, as Lord? It's back in the book of Genesis. It's when the Lord has come visiting Abraham, and He has told Abraham that Sarah's going to have a child. She laughs about it. She doesn't think that's possible. You know why? She's very, very old right now. She's way past the years when anybody would expect a child to be born. And so she makes a comment about that. Shall I have pleasure in my old age and my Lord also? She didn't go around giving Him the title of Lord, but she regarded Him in her heart as Lord. She honored Him. Ladies, do you know something your husband really needs from you? He needs your respect. Not because he's perfect. Abraham wasn't perfect. Abraham had made several mistakes spiritually. And your husband's not going to be perfect. Your wife's not going to be perfect. None of us are going to be able to do all this stuff as well as we wish we could, as well as we wish we had. There was a time when Abraham had understood from God that there would be a child that would be his, and through that child there would be a tremendous blessing come to all the world. The only trouble was Sarah was barren. And so Sarah suggested to him, take my handmaiden and have a child by her. And he did what she said. Well, a little later on then, as we were just referring a moment ago to the passage, and when Sarah is going to have a child, there's a child that comes through her as well, in her old age. Isaac is his name. It means laughter. Well, as the two boys grow together, there's trouble. Between the two women, there's trouble. And finally the day comes when Sarah tells Abraham to cast out the bondwoman and her child. Well, this breaks his heart. This is his child. This is his firstborn child. And God tells him, hearken to your wife. So here Abraham is, the head of the house, with a wife who honors him as Lord, doing what she wants. And it's the Lord's instruction. Gentlemen, we find out many, many times that our wives do have tremendous, tremendous ideas, and we do need to listen. It was a hard one for him. But I want you to notice that this is not a cowering kind of submission in any way. I'm subject to the laws of the state in which I live. And I'm glad of that. I honor that. I respect that. And I appreciate that. And when I'm subject to the laws of God, that is a blessing to have Him in my life. To stabilize the home and the family, also in verse 7, it makes some suggestions to we husbands. Husbands likewise dwell with them, speaking of the wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. What a verse. Gentlemen, you need to understand the pressure your wife is living under, the concern she has about the children, the concern she has about the family, the concern she has about her extended family, her neighbors and her friends and the other things that are bothering her, the concern she has about the household. You need to deal with her with understanding. You need to be aware of her emotional needs. You need to understand how important you are in her life. And he says you need to honor her. Isn't this a beautiful situation where each one honors the other? The wife, the husband, the wife. And there's a phrase here that's translated as the weaker vessel. Honor her as the weaker vessel. In the original language, it's really the idea of the more precious vessel, the prized one. Most of us around our house, we have some ordinary, everyday vessels that we use, and then we have some special ones we just get out for company. At our house, my wife's grandmother had been a collector of teapots. And one of the teapots that we got from Grandma has 14-karat gold leaf on the spout and on the handle. This is a precious, precious teapot. Guess where it sits? High up on the dish cabinet. We don't use it every day. Now, if you come to our house and we're really putting on the dog, we're going to get down Grandma's teapot. But otherwise, it stays up there high, so when you come in, it glistens and it catches your eye, and you go, wow, the teapot! Do you know why that's the case? Well, we had another one of Grandma's teapots down on a regular table. And our little son, who never was born with a ball in his hand, I think, one day was bouncing a basketball through the den, which is a no-no, and all of a sudden we heard crash. We lost that teapot. This teapot is treated very, very special. In your house, it may be some special china. It may be some special crystal. Guys, are you listening? Your wife is that special ornament God has blessed you with. She's that special gift. She's the finest one you've ever received. And God wants you to treat her like that. And then just so you don't get the big head, He also goes on and He reminds you that you are joint heirs. You are equal heirs in the eyes of God. You don't have anything to look down on her about, and you have a lot to look up to her about, because she is God's crowning gift to you and your family. And boy, she is, isn't she? Guys, have you ever tried to watch those kids without her help? How long can you last? Some of you are really tough. Maybe you can make it a day or two. Me, about 3 hours is about as far as I can get. It kind of hurts my feelings when she brings it up. John, I'm going to leave for a while. Can you watch the kids? I say, darling, I'm in charge of souls, of men and women and boys and girls. I visit the hospital. I do counseling. I'm in difficult situations. Don't you think I can watch these children for 3 hours? No. I've only lost 2. One I forgot was with me when I was at church one time, and he was still there when we finally remembered where he was. And I left one at a cemetery after a funeral, but, we got him. Peter says we need to appreciate one another. And then he goes into a description of what will happen to us, gentlemen, if we do not appreciate our wives. If we don't prize them and love them. And he says your prayers will be hindered. Why would that be? Well, let's just say you take a real liking to me, and you say to me after this lesson's over, John, I like you so well, I'm going to give you my brand new Cadillac. And when we come back for the next class, you see me out there doing wheelies with your Cadillac. Or maybe bumping it into the building out here. What would you think of me? How would you react to me? Well, how do you think God feels? After He saw that man down there all alone, and of all the things that He had made, He had said, it's not good for that man to be alone. I'm going to make him a suitable helper that will complete him and bring him happiness all his life. And then He did that, and now there you are mistreating her. God doesn't even want to hear your prayers. Isn't that scary? That is scary. Let me suggest to you some things. Rather, let Peter suggest to you some suggestions on how you live Christianity in your home. Verse 8. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Think about what the other person's dealing with. Give them some room. Love as brothers. What will you do for your brother? Be able to do that for each other. Be tender-hearted and courteous. Sometimes we are more courteous to strangers that we'll never see again than we are to our own family. Have you ever noticed that? Getting a lot of nonverbal amens on that one. We really are, Somehow we think, I can get away with it with you. But no, that's the last person I need to get away with it with. I need to be blessing them every day. There's nobody that's more precious to you than those closest to you in your family. And those little minds especially, they're like tape recorders, and they're recording absolutely every word, every voice tone, everything that happens. They record it all. Peter says we need to be courteous to one another. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling. Do you ever get on that one? Do you know how you start out and maybe the biscuits are burned, but after a while, you're talking about how her mother looks and it just goes downhill from there. Have you ever noticed that? What is that? That's when we're doing this thing of returning evil for evil. You hurt me and I'll hurt you a little more. You ever get that game going? After a while, somewhere along the way, you're going to say, how did we get into this and how did we ever get where we are now? There's another thing you can do. He says, on the contrary, blessing. Who'd ever thought to take Christianity home? You know the difference between a thermostat and a thermometer? If it's hot in here, that thermometer just says, whoosh, it's hot, 80 degrees. But that thermostat, if it's been properly set, it says, whoo, it's 80 degrees, let's cool it down. Let's bring it down to 70. Jesus calls us to be not thermometers, but thermostats in our home. When they get hot, we're not to get hot. We're to return a blessing. Knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Oh, there's so many wonderful blessings that can come to our lives. Let me share with you in the next few moments a study that was done by a man by the name of Nick Sennett. Nick is a member of our fellowship and received an opportunity to study strengths in strong families, strong marriages. And if we're going to try to stabilize unstable families, his study, I think, has a lot to say to us. In a very large study, they were able to isolate 6 different strengths they found present in strong families. And I just want to share those with you before we close. First one they found was appreciation. In these strong families, they appreciated one another. And they expressed that appreciation regularly. They showed it to each other. They encouraged each other. You know, that ties right into what we've been reading about, doesn't it? When was the last time you told your children how much each of them meant to you? When was the last time you told your spouse that? Just expressing appreciation, they found, was absolutely essential in having a strong home. Number 2, the ability to deal with crisis in a positive manner. Did you know trouble's going to come to your life? Trouble's already here, isn't it? It comes. It comes. And usually it comes in some form we do not expect it. A friend of mine has a favorite passage from the Old Testament. It says, "Man who's born of woman is a few days and full of trouble." You're going to have trouble to deal with. How you deal with it, can you be positive about it? That makes all the difference in the world. The writer James says that it's the troubles that come, the trials that come in our life that give us the opportunity to mature, to develop. And it gives our homes an opportunity to mature and develop. My wife has a grandmother who's since passed on. She got to be 96 years of age. And she was a great woman, and we just love her in many ways. And I think of 2 ways in particular that comes to my mind. One time we got our little daughter a puppy dog. And she was proudly telling her grandma about the puppy dog. And grandma says to her, "Well, just name it Trouble because they're always trouble." And you know what? Grandma was right. And another was a story of a grandmother that was lying on a bed very, very ill and probably dying. And her children gathered around her. And one of them said to her, "Grandma, we're just so sorry you're having all this trouble." Grandma says, "Sweetie, life is trouble." Life is trouble. And you and your family are going to have troubles. How are you going to deal with them? Will you pull together? Will you let God be the center and just draw in tighter and stronger? Or will you let it blow you apart? The Lord's there for us anytime. And He's always ready to help us. And our ability to deal with crisis in a positive manner is absolutely essential. And number 3, time together. We already talked about that. They found that strong families saw to it they had time together. You know what? Your kiddos are growing up. If you still got them at home, you're very, very blessed. I remember when my grandmother told me, when we had little ones all around the floor, still junior high and down in their ages. And I remember her saying to me, "John, these are the richest days of your life." Well, man, I couldn't hardly make the bills. I didn't have time to do anything. I couldn't catch my breath. Somebody had to go to the doctor all the time. And I thought, "Grandma, you've really lost something in your old age." But you know, as I look back on it, those are important times. Heard someone say this one time. By the time they're 18, they're pretty well gone. If you don't believe that, wait till you get one, 18. Send them off to college. See how things change. Well, if they're completely gone or nearly completely gone at 18, what are they at 6? 1/3 gone. What are they at 12? 2/3 gone. Make the most of these days. Spend time with those kids. Daddies, date those young girls. Take them out and show them how to honor them. So they'll go looking for a young man that will honor them one day. And spend time with those boys. Let them see how a Christian man deals with his life. Let him see how he thinks and how he moves and what he does and what he dreams about and what's important to him. I love the story of the important man politically who one day took a day off to go fishing with his son. He was the ambassador for a foreign country. When he got back, he wrote in his daytimer, "Took my son fishing, a wasted day." Years later, when that man had died, his son was going through his things and came across the daytimer. Turned to that special day on the calendar, for the boy had written in his diary, "My father took me fishing, the greatest day of my life." And then he found what his dad had written. Dads, we won't get another time to be with those babies this year, but now. I had a son that always could bring me to my knees. It was April one year and I took him fishing. We were climbing up the muddy bank back from the fishing experience and he says, "Well, is that it, Dad?" I said, "What do you mean, is that it?" "Well, is that our fishing for the year?" I said, "Why, no, John." I said, "We'll go a lot more." He said, "Last year we went once in the spring and never again." Didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. Yeah, we can strengthen our homes if we'll just have time together. And dating our children, dating our wives, having special times, it just can't beat it. And then there's a high degree of commitment found in strong families. These people understand that it's till death us do part. Not until gray hair, not until some debilitating sickness comes along, not until someone prettier comes along, but it's till death us do part. We had a very popular series, you may or may not have heard of it, by Faulkner and Bekeen some years ago. When it first came out, it's been around quite a while, and in it Paul Faulkner talks about a lesson on dying to self. And he suggests that just as Christ died on the cross for us to save us from our sins, so we die to Him, or we die to the world so we can come alive to Him, I should say. Well, he goes on to say in the marriage there's a death. You die to yourself and come alive to your spouse. Well, there was a young man in the area that was a preacher who was not married yet. And we did a television program, and these preachers rotated on this panel, and I was the MC. And one day this young man and I, after watching Paul Faulkner talk about this, we were walking home together. And now, he'd had quite a problem. He's a pretty handsome young fella, and every granny, I think, in 3 states had been sicking their granddaughters on him, trying to get him caught. And anyway, he says to me, he says, "John, you know, I finally figured out why I haven't married yet." I said, "Well, why is that?" He says, "I hadn't found a woman yet that I wanted to die for." And I said, "Well, don't you marry one until you do, because sooner or later, if you do marry her, you'll think this woman's killing me." But people who make a commitment, they stay with it. They hang in there. And they find they don't die, they grow. They get better. It makes them stronger. And last of all, and this one wouldn't surprise you, the 6th quality they found was a high level of religious commitment. These people had God very, very important in their lives. Religion was one of their chief values, and it seemed to affect their home life. They were not petty with each other. They were not selfish. They were willing to sacrifice for the good of everyone. Well, that's the list. And as we each work in our own instability to stabilize our homes, may we lean upon the Lord. May we lean upon His Word. May we grow closer to God and closer to one another. Thank you.
Glorify Thy name. in all the